I wanted to hear your perspective on how do you feel about these large-scale demonstrations, whether it was the 2014 protests, 2019 to 2020 protests, which weren't really based around economics, at least the most recent one, but you kind of see this clampdown of government control where Chinese people are trying to rise up from the bottom up, like you mentioned, and you just see the government kind of suppressing that in conjunction with people's finances, social credit, things like that. So what is your perspective on Hong Kong? And like, do you really feel like that is like a completely separate entity from the mainland China?
Yeah, Hong Kong is an entire subject in of itself, right? Probably do like an entire podcast on that. But let's back up a little bit, set a little bit of context for people. So the first thing is that Hong Kong is governed by mainland China under this system called one country, two systems. And the idea is that Hong Kong is administered by the central government, but still has like local elections, still has elections for the chief executive and other positions. Now, it was always anticipated, 2047, which is 50 years after the handover of 1997, that that kind of like compromise would kind of be squeezed together, or like it was left a little bit ambiguous. But the idea was that the United Kingdom handed over Hong Kong to China in return for a guarantee that for at least 50 years, Hong Kong would still have the ability to have local governance, local elections, and things related to that. The protests in 2014, they really stemmed from this idea of universal suffrage that was promised to the Hong Kong people, but not delivered on fully by the central Chinese authorities. And so, for example, the elections for chief executive, they have like these weird things called functional constituencies, and don't want to get too much into the details, but essentially there are ways for the central government to punch above their weight. So it's not really like one vote, one person. If you are in an industry that's like favorable to the mainland, you can like have your vote represented by what's called like constituencies. And so there are ways to like rig the system. So for example, the Chinese government, the central government usually advances and vets the nominees for chief executive, has started doing that for members of the legislative council as well. And so that's kind of like the protest came out of the sense that, hey, like we were promised the ability to govern locally. And I don't think that's happened. I mean, there was like specific reasons. There was like the Chinese government was trying to force like a new education, like curriculum. And, you know, there was student leaders who were rallying against that. But I think the gist of it was that there was this like injustice that happened. Now Hong Kong, as a result of what has happened in the protest, is becoming more and more like the mainland in meaningful ways. And I'll give like a really specific, tangible example of this. Essentially what happened was that there were these national security laws that were passed through kind of a backdoor. And so now you can get arrested under Hong Kong laws for acts that previously you couldn't get arrested for before. And this has applied to people who were legislators, politicians who are running kind of like nomination campaigns, activists, or even anybody who funds, like I've seen people like not fund Substacks anymore that are based in the United States because they could get penalized under the law for doing that, for like supporting someone else writing about Hong Kong issues outside of Hong Kong. And so after that, things have quieted down, I guess you could say, from a political standpoint. I mean, sadly so, I think. There was, I think, meaningful protests that were meant to express a lack of universal suffrage. And instead of delivering on universal suffrage, the Chinese central authorities have decided to impose state power and repression to kind of put in their own version of the system.